In a game like U.C Engage, the main draw is obviously going to be the mobile suits. They're what you see the most in battle, they have the cool EX skills, and the game does a good job of mixing it up so that URs are dispersed between all series and various suits, allowing you to create diverse teams. But at the end of the day, your suits still need pilots. Pilots provide a flat power boost to your suits, which can help when taking on higher difficulty missions, but another benefit that I imagine is overlooked by newer players is pilot skills, which allow you to further boost your suits in battle. In a game like U.C Engage where you don't actually control the gameplay yourself, any advantage you can provide for your team is worth optimizing. So in this video, I'm going to be giving you my pilot recommendations for every single UR suit that's currently in the game. If you enjoy this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more Gundam content, and let's get right into it. If you watched my beginner guide for U.C Engage, which I'll link in the description, you might recall that I briefly mentioned pilot skills and how they work. These skills provide stat buffs to your suits when certain conditions are met, and they're divided into two types. Skill 1 is always related to a suit's type, which of course is the color or its category, and many UR pilots have multiple buffs under this section to cover both a specific type and category. Skill 2 relates to specific unit categories, which are displayed at the bottom of your suit's details screen, and most if not all UR pilots have multiple buffs under this section as well. I'm going to be going through every UR suit in the game and giving you my top 3 pilot recommendations for each one. Obviously, you want to meet as many skill conditions as possible, but here are the general rules that I follow when deciding on a pilot. My goal is always to match at least one of the conditions in Skill 1, whether that be the color or category, and then match at least 2 conditions in Skill 2. This isn't always possible, but it's the ideal situation. One more thing to note before we get started is that my recommendations are going to be specifically for UR pilots. If I tried to include all SR and R pilots as well, this video would be way too long, plus their skills are pretty generic so they don't offer much by way of optimization. Starting off with Record A, our first UR is the blue RX-78 that everybody got for free as part of the launch campaign. My number 1 pick for this suit ironically is the second coming of Amuro-Ray, Camille Bidan. Keep in mind that this is the civilian clothes version. He is the only version in the game right now, but I'm assuming they may add the pilot suit version at some point in the future, and that version will likely have different skills. Camille pairs almost perfectly with this suit because it meets 4 out of his 5 possible skill conditions. The RX-78 is a blue raid unit, so it gets both the 22% increase in reaction after evading and the 38% increased melee sense at the start of a battle from Skill 1. It also has both the Gundam type and prototype unit categories, so it gets a 38% increase in range sense and an additional 38% increase in melee sense from Skill 2, for a total of 76% increased melee sense. My next choice would be Pesce Montaigne, who is an original character from the most recent event as of the writing of this video. As a blue suit, RX-78 meets her first condition in Skill 1, granting it a stacking 26% buff to range sense whenever it takes damage. It also has the 1-Year War, Prototype, and White Mobile Suit unit categories, allowing her to grant it 2 resistance buffs and an accuracy buff. My third choice would be Yonabasta. He gives raid units a 57% increase in melee sense for 10 seconds after EX skill activation, and he also grants White Mobile Suit and Gundam type units 2 additional melee sense buffs. Between Skill 1 and Skill 2, you can boost RX-78's melee sense by a whopping 114% after using your EX skill with Yona as its pilot. Next up is the other RX-78, which is a green generic suit. My first pick is going to be Amuro-Ray, and I'm talking about the UR pilot suit version, not the SR civilian version. Big surprise, he's basically a perfect match and the suit satisfies all of his skill conditions. His Skill 1 gives green suits a stacking 17% resistance buff whenever an enemy is defeated. His Skill 2 gives green suits a 17% accuracy buff, 1-Year War suits a 38% range sense buff, and Gundam type suits a 10% reaction buff. Next up is Uso Iwin. Both his Skill 1 conditions provide a timed buff after using your EX skill, giving green suits an increase in melee sense and generic suits an increase in range sense. Using him also gives the Gundam increased reaction as a protagonist unit and increased range sense as a Gundam type. My third pick is going to be Shiro Amada. His Skill 1 gives green suits a stacking 26% melee sense buff when taking damage and a flat 38% range sense buff to generic suits. His Skill 2 will give the Gundam an accuracy buff as a green suit and a melee sense buff as a 1-Year War suit. You guys probably get the idea at this point, so going forward I'm not necessarily going to point out every single type or category for each skill condition, I'm just going to highlight what buffs the suit receives. For Char Zaku 2, all 3 of my top choices are different versions of Char. The strongest choice is probably the version coded with C0004. The Zaku meets all 5 of his skill conditions, granting it the following buffs. Increased range sense by 95% for 10 seconds after EX skill activation, 76% increased melee sense, 38% increased range sense, and 10% increased evasion. On top of that, the suit itself has a skill that gives it increased movement speed and projectile damage after evading, making this an even stronger pairing. The Origin version of Char also taps into this by giving the suit a flat evasion buff and a stacking 83% increase in melee sense after evading, as well as 2 range sense buffs and a reaction buff. The C0048 version of Char is definitely the weakest of the 3, but still gives his Zaku increased reaction, melee sense, and evasion. Pale Rider is next, and this one is another green generic suit. My first choice here is Shiro, since the suit meets 4 of his 6 skill conditions. He gives it a stacking melee sense buff when taking damage and additional buffs to range sense, accuracy, and melee sense. Pilot suit Amuro is my second pick, granting the suit increased resistance, accuracy, and range sense. And in third is the suit's actual pilot, Chloe Croce. Both her skills focus on evasion, increasing the Pale Rider's evasion by 28% for the first 30 seconds of battle, and granting a stacking 83% increase to range sense after evading. Matsunaga's Zaku 2 is a newer addition from the Nightmare of Solomon event, and oddly enough, 2 of my 3 recommendations are Fetty pilots. Up first is Shiro Amada, who again is probably one of the stronger choices for green suits in general. We already talked about the melee sense buff tied to his skill 1, but that skill also gives a 10% evasion buff to raid suits. Like Char's Zaku, Matsunaga's has a skill that gives it increased projectile damage after evading, so this pairs nicely. Shiro's skill 2 also gives it flat buffs to both accuracy and melee sense at the start of a battle. Second choice is Ko Uraki, the pilot suit or C0009 version. He gives green suits an additional benefit for evading in the form of an 83% stacking range sense increase, which again pairs nicely with the Zaku. Matsunaga's Zaku is also coded as a protagonist unit for some reason, which means it meets both of Ko's skill 2 conditions, giving it increased evasion and a stacking reaction buff after evading. My third choice would be the C0004 Char, and the reason why he's last for this unit is because it only meets 3 of his 5 conditions, receiving both melee sense buffs and an evasion buff. Gato's Rickdom is one of only 3 yellow URs currently in the game, and I'll be honest, the only real choice for a pilot is Gato himself. He was literally made for this suit. It meets all 6 of his skill conditions. Increased melee sense and range sense buffs after using its EX skill, a flat buff to resistance and 2 flat range sense buffs, and a stacking resistance buff whenever the suit takes damage. If the stars align, you can have 133% increased range sense and 52% increased resistance at the same time, turning this suit from a regular armored unit into a goddamn behemoth. If you don't have Gato, your other 2 options are Civilian Banager or Darrell Rona, since they're the only other UR pilots that buff yellow suits. Banager grants a stacking melee sense buff after taking damage, and Darrell gives a stacking melee sense buff after evading. The Psycommu Zaku is another new addition from the newest event, and unsurprisingly, Pesce from the same event is its optimal pairing. The suit meets all 6 of her skill conditions, so it gets the 4 buffs we discussed earlier, as well as the 38% increase in range sense for generics and 10% increase in accuracy for Zaku types. My next choice would be Ru Luca. She gives blue suits a 64% range sense buff, as well as 10% increased accuracy for prototypes and 15% increased accuracy after EX skill activation for white mobile suits. There aren't many other pilots that sync up super well with this suit, so for my third choice I'm going with Aina. She's a good generic choice for almost any red, green, or blue suit because she gives a 64% buff to melee sense and a 17% buff to evasion for all 3. Our last suit for Record A is Char Zaku 1, and you guessed it, my 3 choices are once again the 3 different versions of Char. But the order is a little different this time. I would go with the Origin version first, followed by the C0004 version, and then the C0048 version last. Moving on to Record B, our first unit is the Kämpfer. Once again, as a green 1-year war suit, my first choice is going to be Shiro. Kämpfer gets both the stacking melee sense and flat evasion buff from skill 1, which syncs well since the suit has an evasion related skill, and it also gets the accuracy and melee sense buffs from skill 2. My second choice is Amuro Ray, the pilot suit or C0033 version, which grants the Kämpfer buffs to resistance, accuracy, and range sense. And third is going to be a pilot we haven't mentioned so far, Full Frontal. His skill 1 gives the Kämpfer a stacking 64% range sense buff when an enemy is defeated, as well as a stacking 57% melee sense buff on EX skill activation. As a high mobility unit, Kämpfer also gets the 10% increase to movement speed from his skill 2. Next up is the Thunderbolt version of the full armor Gundam. This suit and the next one are tough to pair with pilots because there are only 2 UR pilots in the game right now who have skills tied to purple suits. My first choice is E.O. Fleming, who grants purple suits a stacking 26% range sense buff when taking damage and a 10% accuracy buff to protagonist units. The next best choice in my opinion would be Pesce. The full armor doesn't meet any of her skill 1 conditions, but it will receive 2 types of resistance buffs and an accuracy buff from her skill 2. My last choice would be the C0033 Amuro. Again, the full armor won't benefit from his skill 1, but will get the range sense and reaction buffs from skill 2. Our last suit for record B is the Zaku I Big Gun. My number 1 choice is Daryl Lauren, since he's a perfect match for the suit, giving it the following 6 buffs. Timed 95% range sense buff after using EX skill, 2 flat 10% accuracy buffs, 2 flat 38% range sense buffs, and a timed 15% range sense buff whenever an ally is defeated. In second place we have Pesce again, who gives the suit both a resistance and accuracy buff, which is nice for a sniper suit. There weren't too many options for a third pick, so I ended up going with Shin Matsunaga since he gives a reaction buff to Zaku types. For record C, our first suit is the GP01, and my first pick for a pilot is going to be the C0080 version of Ko, which is the one in the uniform. The GP01 meets all 3 of his skill conditions, giving it 95% increased melee sense and 57% increased range sense for 10 seconds after EX skill activation, as well as a flat 64% increase to range sense. In second place is Civilian Camille, and the GP01 also meets 3 of his skill conditions, giving it a stacking reaction buff after dodging, as well as melee and range sense buffs. And in third we have Uso, who gives the suit 2 range sense buffs and a reaction buff. Next is the GP01Fb, and to no surprise my first choice is the pilot suit or C0009 version of Ko. He gives the suit the range sense, evasion, and reaction buffs we discussed last time I brought him up, which works well because the suit has an EX skill and 2 skill conditions tied to evasion. Second is going to be Uso, who gives the suit 2 range sense buffs, a melee sense buff, and a reaction buff. And last, I'm going with Aina. The reason I went with her over Shiro in this case is because she gives the suit a buff to evasion, which again ties into its intrinsic skills. The first of the Zeta Gundam suits is the Titans version of the Gundam Mark II. Camille is the obvious first choice here, pairing perfectly with the suit and giving it all 5 of his buffs. My second choice is the newly released C0018 version of Quattro Bagina. He gives the suit a stacking 64% melee sense buff whenever an enemy is defeated, as well as a flat 38% melee sense buff and a 17% reaction buff. My third choice is Jared Mesa, since the Black Mark II is technically a Titan suit despite being stolen. He grants it a 95% increase to melee sense for 10 seconds after using its EX skill, along with a 17% increase to evasion and 38% increase to range sense. And last up for record C is the new Hyaku Shiki. My first choice is of course going to be Quattro, who matches up perfectly. He gives the suit the following 5 buffs. 64% increase to melee sense whenever an enemy is defeated, flat 38% increase to melee sense, 17% increase to reaction, 20% increase to evasion for the first 30 seconds of battle, and 13% increase to EX damage. If you don't have Quattro, my second choice would be Camille, because the Hyaku Shiki meets 4 of his 5 skill conditions, giving it a reaction buff, 2 melee sense buffs, and an accuracy buff. My third choice would be someone like Aina, giving the suit buffs to both melee sense and evasion. The suit has a skill that allows it to recover health whenever it evades, so evasion can be a very strong stat to spec into. Moving on to record D, our first suit is Puru's Qubeley Mark II. Puru isn't even in the game, so I think the next best choice is Masha Marcello. The suit doesn't meet his skill 1 condition, but it meets 4 of the conditions in skill 2. This gives it a stacking 7% resistance buff when taking damage, 38% increased range sense, 10% increased accuracy, and 13% increased EX damage. However, it is worth noting that since the Qubeley Mark II's EX skill is a stat buff and doesn't actually do damage, I'm not sure if that last skill condition increases the potency of the buff or if it just doesn't get any benefit at all. My second choice is Full Frontal, who grants the suit buffs to range sense, melee sense, and movement speed. My last choice is once again going to be Aina, because this suit has a skill that provides a buff after evading, in this case being a 14% increase to projectile damage resistance. Up next is the Hamma Hamma, and Mashima is going to be our first choice for this one as well. It meets 5 of his 6 skill conditions, so it gets the range sense, accuracy, and EX damage buffs I just mentioned, as well as an additional 64% boost to range sense and 10% increased accuracy. There aren't many other pilots that sync up well with this suit, so my second choice is Aina to give it buffs to both melee sense and evasion. My third choice is the C0047 version of Riddy Marcinus, since he's the only other pilot that gives the suit more than one buff, granting it increased melee sense and accuracy. The S Gundam is our last suit for Record D, and it just so happens to match up perfectly with Ru Luca, meeting all 5 of her skill conditions. She gives it the following benefits: 2 64% buffs to range sense, 10% buff to accuracy, and 57% and 15% increases to range sense and accuracy respectively after EX skill activation. Second choice is going to go to Pesce, since the S Gundam is a bombardment suit and she gives it increased range sense, accuracy, and resistance. My third pick would be Civilian Camille, who gives the suit increased reaction after evading and buffs to both ranged and melee sense. Next up is Record E, and strap in because this is a long one. Rigazi is first up, and this thing has a lot of unit categories to work with. My first pick is going to be Camille, who I'm sure you've noticed by now is a pretty solid choice for most blue suits. He'll give the Rigazi buffs to reaction, range sense, and melee sense. Second pick goes to Pesce, another very strong character who will give the suit 2 boosts to range sense and 1 to accuracy. And my third pick is going to be Uso, who gives the suit 2 buffs to range sense and 1 to reaction. Our next suit is Nightingale, which was featured in the first limited banner shortly after the game launched. This suit is a bit of a glass cannon. It's got pretty high attack power but very low health compared to other suits. To give you an example, my Nightingale and Pale Rider are both level 80 with skill rate 10 and level 1 potential unleashed, and the Pale Rider has almost double the HP of Nightingale. So you have options when playing this suit. You can either lean into this role or try and boost its defense or evasion to mitigate its weaknesses. My personal favorite pilot for this suit right now is Mashima. His skill 2 gives it a stacking resistance buff whenever it takes damage, along with buffs to range sense, accuracy, and EX damage. If you want to go the other direction, my second pick would be Shiro. He gives the suit a stacking melee sense buff when taking damage, as well as increasing both its accuracy and evasion, which can help with conserving what little HP that you have. Same kind of idea for number 3, I'm going with Aina for the increases in both melee sense and evasion. High New Gundam is a suit that I don't think is technically available yet because you have to buy the blueprints with Rainbow Haro coins, which are hard to come by, but we'll cover it anyway. First choice is once again going to be Camille, and he'll grant the suit a stacking buff to reaction after evading, 2 buffs to melee sense, and 1 to range sense. My second choice is going to be Aina for the increase in melee sense and evasion, and third is Pesce for the buffs to range sense and accuracy. Unicorn Gundam is the second of the 3 yellow URs in the game right now, making pilot choices kinda difficult, but thankfully it's also a generic. Number 1 choice is going to be Civilian Banashir, who gives the suit a total of 6 buffs. Stacking 26% increase to melee sense when taking damage, 2 38% increases to range sense, 38% increase to melee sense, 10% increase to accuracy, and 16% increase to reaction when HP reaches 60%. My second choice is Pilot Suit Banashir, who gives the suit flat buffs to reaction and critical rate, as well as a stacking range sense buff on critical hits. In third, we have Uniform Riddy, who gives the suit increased melee sense, evasion, and accuracy. NTD Unicorn was the very first banner that came with the launch of the game, and our pilot choices are going to be the same, just in different order. Pilot Suit Banashir is my top pick since he gives this version of the Unicorn all the buffs we just mentioned, as well as a 73% increase to range sense after HP drops to 80%. Civilian Banashir is second because he gives all the same buffs except for the stacking melee sense buff on taking damage, since this Unicorn is green instead of yellow. Riddy is third, and he gives the exact same benefits as he did for the base Unicorn. Next we have Banshee, which is only currently available by buying blueprints using arena medals. Our first choice is going to be Uniform Riddy, who gives the suit all the buffs we already mentioned, plus an additional 38% increase to melee sense. His buff to evasion is also super beneficial because the Banshee's skills give it stacking buffs to both beam damage and beam damage resistance after evading. My second choice is Yona, and he gives a stacking reaction buff when defeating enemies and 2 stacking buffs to melee sense after EX skill activation. For my third pick, I'm going with All Reliable Aina for that increased evasion that pairs so well with Banshee. Delta Plus is another suit where there's only one pilot that truly matches up well with it, and that's Pilot Suit Riddy. He gives the suit a stacking 21% increase to range sense when dealing damage and 2 10% accuracy buffs. My second choice would be the origin version of Char for the melee sense, range sense, and reaction buffs, and third would be Aina for her melee sense and evasion buffs. Next we have Byarlant Custom, sometimes lovingly referred to as Kobe Byarlant for its performance at Torrington Base. Since it's a raid suit, my first choice is going to be the C0047 version of Riddy, who gives it 2 melee sense buffs and an accuracy buff. My second choice would be Camille, and his buffs are pretty similar, 2 melee sense buffs and a stacking reaction buff after evading. My third choice is Rue, and she's a good pick if you want to spec into range, granting the suit 2 range sense buffs and an accuracy buff. The last suit in Record E is Sinanju, and this suit is currently only available via blueprints acquired from fragment quests. The obvious first pick here is Full Frontal, giving the suit a total of 6 additional buffs. Stacking 64% increase to melee sense when an enemy is defeated, timed 57% increase to melee sense after EX skill activation, 2 38% increases to melee sense, and 2 10% increases to movement speed. My second choice would be the C0004 version of Char, giving the suit increased melee sense, range sense, and evasion. In third place we have Pilot Suit Riddy, who gives the suit a stacking range sense buff when dealing damage and 2 accuracy buffs. Last but not least, we have Record F, starting with the Narrative Gundam. Number 1 pick for this one is Yona, giving it a reaction buff, a range sense buff, and not 1, not 2, but 3 melee sense buffs. Camille is going to take second place, granting the narrative his range sense buff and both melee sense buffs. And for the third pick, I'm going with Aina for the melee sense and evasion buffs. Victory Gundam is up next, and obviously my top pick here is going to be Uso because it satisfies all 5 of his skill conditions. He grants the suit increased melee and range sense after EX skill activation, as well as increased reaction, range sense, and accuracy. My second pick is Shiro for the melee sense, accuracy, and range sense buffs, and my third is Pilot Suit Amuro for the buffs to resistance, accuracy, and reaction. Our final suit is the Berga-Dalas, which is also the last of the 3 yellow UR suits. Dorel Rona is the top choice here, granting the suit a stacking 83% increase to melee sense after evading, as well as 38% increased melee sense and 10% increased evasion. My second pick is the C0004 Char because he gives the suit increased melee sense and evasion, and the Berga-Dalas gets health back when it evades. My third pick is Civilian Banager since he gives yellow suits a stacking melee sense buff when taking damage, as well as increased reaction when health reaches 60%. And there you have it, those are my top 3 pilots for every single UR unit currently in UC Engage, but of course this is unfortunately not an evergreen guide. New suits will continue to come out that will not be in this video, and new pilots will come out that might be better choices than the ones I've listed. But I hope that after watching this video you now have a feel for what to look for when selecting a pilot for your mobile suits. I'm enjoying UC Engage more and more, and making this video made me even more excited to keep building out my collection so I can optimize my teams. I'm sure some of you have other pairings for suits and pilots that you'd like to suggest, so feel free to share those in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a positive rating to help me in my boss battle against the algorithm. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one.